Hi, everyone. You're listening to Bug Talk, a podcast created by members of the entomology department at Michigan State University. In today's podcast, we're talking to Sheila Colla. Hi, Sheila.
Hi there.
And Sheila is coming to us from Toronto. Very exciting to have another international guest on the podcast. It's been a while for us. So thank you for joining us. And can we start, Sheila, with you introducing yourself a little bit? Please talk to us about sort of the beginnings of where you're from, where you grew up.
Wow, okay. So I'm an assistant professor at York University in Toronto, and I'm from Toronto. I actually now live 5 minutes from the hospital where I was born, which is kind of unusual for academia. But I was able to stay in the city that I grew up in for my undergrad, my PhD, and now as a professor, just kind of moving around the universities here. That's been amazing, especially because I have 2 young kids and I have family close by, which has been really helpful. And also I think that's rare for academics to have that kind of family support. So
Definitely.
Very grateful.
Was that sort of part of your plan to stay close to family, or it just happened to work out this way? Was that intentional or just by chance, I guess?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of both. I think I was lucky, but I also think because I wanted to stay close to home, I applied for jobs that maybe weren't like the perfect fit. So for example, this job that I have now, it was professor of environmental management. And I consider myself an entomologist or a conservation biologist. So, but in the description, it mentioned like biodiversity conservation. So I just went for it thinking it was a complete long shot. And then I ended up getting the job. So I think that's a pretty good lesson for people thinking about this kind of thing, like to really throw your hat in, even if you don't think that, you have a good shot maybe, but if it's a place or an institution that you really want to be in, maybe it's worth thinking about. And then I also tailored my job talk around sort of more conservation management type ideas, which was a bit of a stretch, but I made it happen, and so far it's been really good.
Yeah. So going back to your earlier life, can you talk to us a little bit about how you got interested in science, or more specifically biology? When did that happen? How did it happen? Who influenced you?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I've always sort of done well in science, I guess, in high school. I had some really good science teachers that made it really interesting, and I think that helped gauge my interest in there. So I applied for science programs for my undergrad, and I ended up at the University of Toronto, mostly for like pre-med type stuff, so like human biology. But for biology, you have to take first year biology, which is like a class of, I don't know, more than 1,000 students, and half of it is ecology and evolution, and half of it is more like molecular biology and sort of the more traditional stuff. So I guess I sort of got interested in ecology and evolution there, maybe not before then, but I didn't know as like a child or a teenager that you could get a job doing anything in biology that wasn't like a doctor, right? So that's how I sort of ended up in the program that I ended up in when I switched to a zoology degree there. And then at the University of Toronto, they have, instead of a course, you can do research in a lab in your second year of undergrad. So pretty early on, I applied for that. And when you apply for that, I don't think you actually get to choose where you end up. It's just like, do you want to do research? So yeah. And I ended up in James Thompson's lab, and he studies bumblebees. So before then, I actually remember talking to him as like, I was interviewing for this position. I thought wasps were bees. I thought they were pests. I was scared of bees, which were wasps, and I really knew absolutely nothing about bees. I grew up in the city. My family, were immigrants. We didn't go camping. It was not a thing. So through that, getting that sort of second year research course, I ended up having to get very familiar with bees because James Thompson his lab did a lot of like behavioral type experiments. So inside cages with bees. So I'd be in there like filling up flowers with bees, like emptying them, go sort of following bees around and filling them up. So I was like within inches of these bees, which helped me get over my fear. And I had to spend a lot of hours watching them live, crawl from their colony into these cages and fly around and make decisions. And then also I got to watch many, many hours of videotape because we would be quantifying different behavioral interactions. So I got really familiar with bumblebees, like way more familiar in, 8 months than I had been for my entire life before then. And then through that, I started helping some of the grad students in his lab in the summers doing field work. So I did some field work in Southern Ontario looking at bumblebee diseases, and some field work in Colorado at the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory looking at bumblebee and hummingbirds and their foraging preferences with penstemon flowers. And Colorado is a really nice place to study pollinators in the mountains. So I basically that one decision to do this research course led to all of these other things. And by the time I finished my 4th year, I had done like an honors thesis that was published on pathogen spillover of managed bees to wild bees. And I realized that there wasn't anyone in Canada studying declines of wild bees, wild bumblebees. So I approached Lawrence Packer out of my undergrad to say, like, there's from some of the surveys I've done with grad students at James Thompson's lab, it looks like we're missing some species, but no one is like studying them. Can I do that for a PhD? And Lawrence Packer studies like tiny sweat bees. Like he has never taken on someone who studies something as charismatic as bumblebees. So it took a little bit of convincing, but he took me on as a PhD student. And that's when I started working more on bumblebee conservation.
Well, there's one question that we have to get out of the way. Do you get stung often by bees, and how did you get over your fear of that?
So in terms of getting over the fear, I mean, just being in those cages, like the bumblebees never attacked me or anything. I was like very close to them. I was basically breathing on them. So I definitely got over my fear with that. And I'm pretty careful. Like I've seen Lawrence like put his hand in a net and like try to grab a Xylocopa carpenter bee like by the wings to like, show people. And I don't do that kind of thing. I'm very careful with my net and my vials. So I've never been stung. I mean, I think I've been stung maybe like less than 5 times doing field work. Sometimes when it's happened, it's been like, I think I have 1 bee in the net, but I actually have 2. I think I'm grabbing a male, but it ends up being a female. Just happened once. And then another time I was feeding a colony of bees in the lab and I threw the pollen in, but I was a little too slow with the closing of the colony. So I did get stung because they're very protective of their colony, obviously. But it's literally been less than 5 times in 15 years. So it's pretty good record.
I think that's really important information for all the students out there that are thinking about taking this field and are maybe hesitant of getting stung often. Like, you have had this career so far and only 5 times is a really good number.
Yeah. And like every single time it was completely my fault. It wasn't like I was just randomly walking around and I got attacked by something. It was like, oh yeah, I was too slow, or oh, I didn't see that bee there, or whatever. So each time it was a learning experience, and it helps me be more careful going forward.
Another question I had, you mentioned this like really influential undergraduate experience. Was that a paid position or did you volunteer to do that?
So it was instead of a course. So I got course credit for it. And then since I spent that, 2 semesters doing that instead of a course, then I had already been trained. So then James Thompson hired me to be a field assistant for like the next 2 summers for his grad students, because I had the techniques on how to, feed bees, take care of bees, do the different experiments and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and just a little bit backtracking, where do you think that interest in biology came from that eventually led to, going to university studying in that field?
I mean, I think it was mostly my high school teachers and how passionate they were about it. But my dad's a music teacher. Both my parents are teachers, and my dad used to bribe me with like stickers to practice the piano. And I had like this World Wildlife Fund sticker book with like different endangered species that he used to like bribe me to do the piano lessons with. So if I think back, like I guess I was interested in them back then, but it never really like clicked that it could be like a job or career or anything like that. I was literally just collecting pictures of rare species, which ended up being like what I do for my job, but not pictures of actual real animals.
Right. But you were not one of those kids that was running around catching insects
No.
or butterflies or anything.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, I think a lot of entomologists are not from that thread, it's a
Mhm.
few people that end up becoming entomologists that are, the butterfly chaser kids. I myself wasn't that interested in entomology until later in my life as well.
Mhm.
Um, I want to come on to talking a little bit about more broadly people that have influenced you. And you've mentioned a few people that you have worked for, but beyond that, who are the people that you look up to or have had major impact on your career so far? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think like James Thompson and Lawrence Packer, I got really lucky because they were always very supportive supervisors.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was really fortunate for my postdoc to get into the Librero Fellowship Program, which is kind of like the Smith Fellows in the US. So the idea there is there's like a cohort of people in the same career stage as you, and you're doing conservation work, but you're also like encouraged to do other things like learn science communication, do media training, go talk to politicians, write papers together on things like outside of your discipline.
Mm-hmm.
So that was really lucky too, that I was able to be a part of that network, because now some of my best friends, best colleagues and collaborators are all part of that network as well. And I get to work with people who study things like coyotes and bats and like other conservation fields. So I'm not sort of siloed into like the entomology world or the bee world, which for me has been very important, especially as a woman of color, because the entomology field tends to be very like white male dominated, and it was never really a comfortable place to be. Like a lot of the conferences, I always felt like I would, I didn't look like the other people there, especially the other professors there. Like maybe I look like the grad students. So anyway, so being a part of like the broader conservation, wildlife conservation
Mm-hmm.
network, especially like early career stage individuals, like having them to like talk to about issues and to like be excited about research with and that kind of thing has been extremely helpful to me. And I wish everybody had that support network, which, very few people do, but I'm trying to build it like as I go forward with my own we call them HQP here, like your grad students, your lab researchers that you train. Highly qualified personnel is like the
I see.
federal term for it. So I always think HQP, but no one knows what I'm talking about when I say that.
So
But I do, yeah, my graduate students, my research assistants, like all of those people that you train. Trying to think about not only doing the research projects, but also like training in other things like in science communication or doing outreach, like going to schools, talking about insects, writing blog posts, doing press releases, policy briefs, if you have something that's kind of policy relevant research results. So I do try to like work it in as much as I can.
And so you talked a little bit about your graduate students, and I'm wondering how you have thought about like forming your lab. You had mentioned that you started your current position in 2015. And so can you talk a little bit about what your thinking was about, with your background, how did you want to set up a lab? How did you want to shape that?
Yeah, so I think with like everything, I've just basically taken opportunities as they arise. I'm not sure I've always had like this goal in front of me that I'm working towards. But I did realize pretty early on that even though I'm trained to like go out into a field and collect bumblebees and identify them to species and calculate diversity and abundance and all of these conservation metrics that we do, and look at habitat and ecology type questions to figure out how we can best support native bumblebees, that humans are actually a really important part of this puzzle. So it ended up being lucky that I did this environmental management, job talk, and ended up in a faculty that is very interdisciplinary, where the ecologists are actually the minority of the people there. So I'm in a department with like urban planners and social scientists and people who do art and humanities. So I would say like half of my lab ended up being people who are interested in more like policy or citizen science, and that kind of thing. And my postdoc actually is a geographer who's working on more policy type work. And then the other half is more like doing sort of habitat and species diversity type research, conservation planning, and that kind of thing.
It's really interesting how you describe your department or the group that you're involved with. Does this lead to a lot of like being a coPI on projects that are very different from how you were taught, maybe, or your upbringing background?
Yeah, definitely. I always feel like I'm just like, jack of all trades, master of none at this point. But even like what I'm trained in, like identifying bumblebees after writing the book with Paul Williams and Leif Richardson and Robin Thorpe, like the bumblebees of North America, I actually feel like am less confident in my ability to identify, because then you realize like how hard all of this is. So I really just feel like I'm not an expert in anything anymore. And the best way of doing research and solving problems is to collaborate with as many people who think differently than I do and learn from them and learn with them. So almost all my projects are very collaborative and large, and a lot of them are interdisciplinary. My biggest project right now is actually with another faculty member, Lisa Myers, who does Indigenous art curation.
Wow.
Yeah. And we just took that opportunity as it arose, but we're learning a lot. She studied an Indigenous artist, Mike McDonald, who in the 90s planted pollinator gardens as a form of resistance. He was upset about some logging that was happening in northern British Columbia on Indigenous lands, where there was like land claim issues. And while he was there, he saw all these butterflies. He was thinking about how these butterflies were going to lose their habitat if this logging happened. And he spoke to elders there, and they told him that butterflies were their ancestors. And if you're feeling sick, you follow the butterflies to the plants, and they'll tell you which medicine you need for your sickness. And I just thought that was really interesting, because we drink things like echinacea or peppermint or chamomile, things that like butterflies or bees would like visit, right? So it was just really interesting, like to think about how little I know about different knowledge systems and this connection of pollinators to human health. We think about bees so much in terms of agriculture, like large scale agriculture, and how they're pollinating these large crops, but we don't think about them in terms of like Indigenous medicine plants and pollination of like our urban farms in poor and racialized neighborhoods. And so I've been trying to think more about like those components of pollinator conservation, which not a lot of people are thinking about, and learning from an artist curator about this artist who was like planting pollinator gardens as art installations and as a form of resistance to like convert land back to how it was supposed to be. When now pollinator gardens are like so mainstream, it's almost uncool not to have a pollinator garden. So it's just really interesting to see how that discourse, that understanding has changed over time.
Is that particular to your area in Toronto, that people are planting so many pollinator gardens? I mean, I know it's a trend here too, but just to give you an example, for my neighbor is still spraying his lawn with insecticides. And so I feel bad about putting any kind of pollinator friendly plants, because I know that those insecticides are just going to be soaked up into the plants that I'm planting. which eventually are going to go into the bees. So I'm kind of like torn and feel like we're still in the cusp of people learning and understanding and being educated on this issue. I'm wondering how you see it over there.
So I guess it's kind of a complicated question. I think your example shows that like disconnect. So people love bees and they know bees are important, but then when it comes to their own little piece of land, maybe they don't want insects on there. But if you ask them, they would probably say like, yes, I really care about bees. So there's that. But also since I started working on bees, which is like 2003, people have just become obsessed with this topic. And every spring there's like a new obsession. And whereas when I started, no one cared. When I was doing my bee surveys, people would be like, what are you looking for? Are you taking the bees off the plants because they're hurting them? Like there was like zero understanding about like the ecosystem services that bees provided. So it's definitely more mainstream now. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that. So National Geographic did a Facebook poll and they asked like, if you could save one species, what would it be? And there was things like sharks and pandas and cheetahs and stuff, and the bee won by far, which is so like mind-blowing, because when I was a kid it was like, oh no, you want to save like tigers and pandas, like or polar bears, yeah, not the bee, whatever species the bee is. And then in Ontario we have like public commentary for environmental issues. And the pollinator policy got 52,000 comments, which is the most that any environmental issue has ever gotten in the existence of our Environmental Bill of Rights. And the same week, the climate action plan was also posted, and that only got 500 comments. So 52,000 for bees and 500 for climate action, which is pretty ridiculous. As a pollinator conservationist, I would have liked more people to have been engaged in the climate action plan. But no kidding. People just are obsessed with bees, and it's good, but it also means that we spend some time kind of trying to corral that interest away from like honeybees, away from bee hotels, away from like misunderstanding like what the threats are. We recently, last year, we published a study that showed sort of the public understanding in Canada around bees and pollinator conservation. And like half of the people thought the European honeybee was a native wild species. And over 80% thought the loss of flowers was like the main, loss of flowers and pesticide use were like the main two threats to bees, which is not the case for the bees that I study anyway.
Right. So how do you feel is like more broadly speaking, I guess, how do you feel is your work and science supported in Canada? You know, we have had our issues over the last 4 years here in the United States with the lack of science support. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that's playing out in Canada.
You might be surprised to know that actually it's better in the US in a lot of ways, and it has been even in the last 4 years. In Canada, I find that a lot of the policy and research money goes towards like honeybees and the honeybee industry and benefiting the industry. It's really hard to argue for conservation of wild pollinators, but I think in the US it's a little bit easy. And to give you an example, like I assessed federally I wrote the assessment report for the rusty flesh bumblebee, and it was listed as endangered in Canada in like 2010. So 10 years later, we still have done like nothing in terms of its conservation. Whereas in the US Fish and Wildlife Service has already like developed some like captive breeding workshop materials and reports and like thinking about all sorts of different things. Whereas in Canada, we haven't even started 10 years later. And we have a bunch of other bee species that have been assessed to be at risk of extinction and haven't even been put on the endangered species list yet. So it's very slow. And I think part of it is like people think like, oh, we're like helping the honeybees. Like there's this whole movement of like urban honeybees and restricting pesticide use. So it's like in the public's mind, there's a lot being done on this issue. But for me, there's like almost nothing being done. Yeah.
And so that translates to grant support or financial support or the lack of it as well.
Yeah. There's, I mean, I think my research is easier to fund than like, like some sort of aquatic invertebrate that no one cares about, for sure. So I can't complain in that sense. Like if I write about, I write a grant about pollinators, generally people will understand that it's important. So there's that. And there are definitely opportunities where I can use that public interest and political will to access funds that I wouldn't have otherwise. And this project that I'm doing with Lisa Myers, called Finding Flowers, is an example of taking research money for a topic that's like important, that people are interested in, like pollinator conservation, and then redirecting it to like learn more about like indigenous sovereignty and food production, like a small scale food production. So there are definitely ways that I can sort of move around resources in that way that I wouldn't be able to if it wasn't on the public's radar. But like millions and millions of dollars go into honeybee research, and that's not the case for wild bee research. Yeah.
And it's the government that's putting the dollars into the honeybee research. It's not like beekeepers or, yeah.
Yeah, it's probably a combination. There's also like this whole other set of money that's like businesses wanting to be sustainable and then like putting honeybee hives as their like sustainability initiatives. So if they had actually put that money into other sustainable initiatives, I don't know how much money that would be, but I suspect quite a bit, because that's like private sector businesses with a lot of money, access to money. So that's like the whole like bee washing thing that Charlotte de Kaiser has been talking about. But there's probably millions of dollars available there that have gone into honeybee hives and not into native pollinator work.
Is that also something that you see when you're recruiting graduate students? It seems like here in the United States now we have, a generation growing up on bee research and funding. When I did my PhD, really people didn't care about any of this. So there wasn't any funding and hardly any students were working on pollinators. But then there was this like trend that came along, and it seems to me that labs, at least in the US, that are working on pollinators have like a line of potential graduate students out the door because there are so many people that are interested and wanting to work in these labs. Is that what you're seeing too?
Maybe it's a little bit different in the US, because in Canada there are so few of us working on it. So I mean, I definitely get students who are interested in working on bees and they come my way, but I wouldn't say there's like lineups. Yeah.
Is that, are there like recruitment funds that you can use, or how are generally graduate students funded?
Yeah, so in my faculty, the actual faculty funds are graduate students, so I don't have to pay for them. They don't need any funding, they just TA. I think it's a very different situation in Canada than the US. I don't really spend a ton of money on grad students.
I see.
I spend most of it on research, but then there's less research money available. So I guess it all evens out. So yeah, and then we also at York University, we have like a bee research center. So there's Amro Zayed, who studies honeybees and genomics, and he does some work with bumblebees as well. And then Lawrence Packer, who's a taxonomist, and Jane Heffernan, who does like modeling work. She's a mathematician, and Sandra Rehan, who works on all sorts of things around wild bees, including Ceratina, the small carpenter bee, and some like socio-behavior, but she does a bunch of different types of things. So I think because there's a whole group of us that work on bees, it also makes a lot of people do come to us specifically to work on research, and they have access to like, they could be co-supervised and they can work across all these different disciplines, still studying things about bees. So that's pretty good. So we haven't had to like go out and recruit, and we're pretty lucky, but I know Amro Zayed right now is looking for a few postdocs. So hopefully he gets people applying for that. And yeah, we always apply for grants and hopefully can take on new students.
So something that you had mentioned was that you're doing citizen science or community science, as I think now the term is evolving. And I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about that and more broadly about like your program's relationship to social media, and how you use that. You talked about policy So yeah, talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I guess there are not too many bumblebee researchers, at least there weren't like 5 years ago. So we all had our inboxes full of people sending us pictures and asking us if it was like the rusty patch bumblebee. And it was just like, we just wanted to like have a way of capturing this information that wasn't just in our inboxes full of these picture files. So with the Xerxes Society and based off of eButterfly, the like butterfly citizen science project, we launched Bumblebee Watch, which is available for free as a phone app, or you can use the website. And now that's with a few partners, including Wildlife Preservation Canada. So that's been really, really successful. We haven't linked it with iNaturalist because bumblebee identification is so difficult. So we try to keep it so that experts are doing the identifications, which slows us down quite a bit, but it means our data set is really high quality. And I have a PhD student who's working with the data set to explore it a little bit more.
Is that only for Canadian participants or anywhere, or North America?
Yeah, so US and Canada.
US and Canada. And so the way that it works is that participants send a photo of a bee that's being evaluated, as you mentioned, or identified by your graduate student.
So you can upload any pictures of bumblebees to the site, and then it will be identified by an expert, either someone, they're not all grad students. So like Rich Hadfield from the Xerxes Society does a lot of the like Western states. There's a bunch of people doing identification, so that's really great. But yeah, it's definitely the limiting factor. But the good news is if people like keep submitting, we have this like historical database that's constantly growing in terms of what species are where. It tends to be more like in cities and where people are, but it's still really important information about where bees are nesting and what they're feeding off of. And we've been able to use the data in a lot of ways. Like we've expanded ranges, like historical ranges. We've submitted expert testimony. There were bombus impatiens found mating in British Columbia. So that was evidence that, the bumblebees were being used there in greenhouses and they were escaping and they were mating in the wild. And that was just sent to us by someone who didn't even know what they were looking at, right? So, and I was able to send that to the federal government to be like, look, we need to do something about this. Not that they did, but anyway, it definitely helps us track like the movement of species outside of their ranges and a whole bunch of like natural history information. There's going to be like such a amazing data set there for people to work on in the future.
So you mentioned that there's also metadata collected with this like GPS coordinates, I'm guessing, for the collection, like what
and
plant they were on or something.
Yeah, so the plant, there is an option for people to fill it out if they know what it is, but someone's going to probably have to go back through most of them and like identify the plants. But it's still, because most of the time when people send pictures of bees, they're on plants, right?
Yeah. And so do you make this available for people to come and work with the data, analyze it, publish with it?
Yeah, on the website. Yeah, on the website, bumblebeewatch.org. There's like an option for researchers and they can request the data. They just need to fill out an online form and then they'll be sent the spreadsheet.
That's amazing. I will make sure to leave a link to that website in the show notes so people can see that. And so like you mentioned a little bit about like, you've discovered things that eventually didn't lead to policy changes, but on the flip side, have you seen any positive examples of, actually making a change?
Yeah, so in the US, I think a lot of our more recent records of the rusty patch bumblebee have been records submitted by citizen scientists. So we're getting more information about that species through this program, which is really good. And then I think there's there's value that can't really be measured in that people are using this. And people ask me like, how can I help save the bees? And this is like the way to help save the bees, not buying a bee condo or putting a hive on your rooftop or whatever. So this is a free way of helping us. Yeah. It helps us collect data and it's expanding our coverage so much more than we'd be able to the way I used to, which is just driving around looking for flowers and collecting data. So I think giving people like a way that they can help that is actually useful and doesn't cost any money is really valuable. And then also you have people now outside observing flowers and looking at all the different things that are visiting there. So they're not like people like me who think yellow jacket wasps are like the bees, and you know, and you can get up close and personal to take this picture. So like they get over their fear as well. So there's all these like intrinsic values that are really hard to quantify, but it probably helps with like a general cultural shift and helps with that connection of people like observing wildlife and helping in ways that's actually like, yeah, useful.
And you mentioned that it's not currently connected to iNaturalist, but can you talk a little bit about what the advantages of that would be?
So iNaturalist has more money behind it, so it's kind of like a more user-friendly app. And then the community identifies the species, so that could lead to misidentifications.
So you don't actually have access to the raw information coming in?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So yeah, I mean it's a trade-off, but right now we're pretty happy with what we have, so we'll just keep going with it. And yeah, we always try to make it better, right? Every year we try to make improvements, but yeah, it requires time and money.
Yeah, for sure. And how did the app development work out for you?
Xerxes Society mostly led that part of it.
Okay.
And they work with the Birds in the Hand company, which I think does the eBird app as well. So they're people that do these kinds of things, and they did it for I think a pretty substantial discount because they just really care about the topic. So it's been good.
Yeah, we did a much smaller community science project a couple of years ago on squash bees, and we also looked into having an app developer help us, and it was cost prohibitive, so we had to find a way to do it ourselves. And so we just used Google Sheets and hacked it ourselves and made an app that, you know, wasn't perfect, but it was free, or so to speak, you know, graduate student labor. And we actually targeted master gardeners, so we helped them like work through the app, and we talked to them about like what the bees look like and all that, so they would be more likely to submit accurately identified bees. And especially, you know, with something like the squash bee that's so like not easy if you're not a bee person to identify, can be confused with especially the honeybee. It was very important for us to try to do that. But yeah, I think that now I feel like there's a more and more people that are working on more broadly, maybe pest or, you know, beneficials, who would like to have ways to develop apps that are easy to do and they have control over, and it's not cost prohibitive. So I'm always interested in talking to people that have been through that process. And I guess yours is a good example of partnering with somebody that had that capacity to help you through that process. So that's another way to do it, as opposed to ours, which we kind of like went through the back door, I think, a little bit.
Yeah.
So I guess maybe a couple last questions here that I wanted to talk to you about. But what positive things do you see in the future coming for bumblebees, more broadly for pollinators? How do you see some brightness at the end of this tunnel that we're in right now?
I think being a conservationist is always going to be slightly depressing because you have a sort of a better understanding of the world in some ways. But I do think we can capture some of this energy around people wanting to save the bees to tackle larger societal problems and larger environmental challenges. So I think using bee conservation to help people understand more about climate change is something that's like quite easy to do, because you can see when the spring flowers freeze and the bees don't have food anymore, and when the bees come out too early and everything's still covered in snow, and like all of these like mismatches with weather. And it's just like really easy to visualize if people are already out there watching bees and flowers and paying attention. So I think it does allow us opportunities to think about this more. And then I think with COVID as well, people have taken to gardening a little bit more, thought about where our food comes from a little bit more, because we had like some disruptions in the food chain and that kind of thing. So I think there's like an increased awareness around that. And also the whole like pathogen spillover issue, which is like probably the main reason why our bumblebees are in decline, is a lot more easy to communicate now that we've actually experienced it as humans in recent memory. So I think that'll give us some opportunities to think about, bee movement and screening for diseases and trying to capture these spillover events before they knock out entire species without us realizing it, which is kind of what happened with the rusty patch bumblebee.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are, I guess, some opportunities ahead for sure.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe lastly, just leave us with where can people find you? You have already mentioned the website. If you could repeat the website name, and then also if you have any social media presence, if you could let us know about that.
Yeah, so our Finding Flowers project, which is the one with the Indigenous art work, is at findingflowers.ca. We're working on a website, and then on Instagram, it's Finding Flowers Media. And my Twitter handle is Save Wild Bees. And then we mentioned bumblebeewatch.org, which is our citizen science project. And I think that's pretty much it. And then our bee research unit at York is just bees.yorku.ca.
Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time and for coming on to the podcast and talking to people. I really appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks so much for having me.
All right.